Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's great to have you with us today for this roundtable. Today we are going to address a very fundamental matter, which is information and democracy and journalism. We are going to investigate whether journalism can reinvigorate democracy. And it's a very important question 1 week before European elections, in which obviously information, politics, foreign meddling are now part of our political spectrum. A revolution has occurred in the way information is now produced and consumed. Each big election is a battleground of distortions and distractions, where facts are often obscured by polemics. And the big question is, how do citizens make informed, democratic choices about the sort of society they want to live in? And it's obvious that the traditional media industry in many countries is not really able to cope with the new technological, sociological, and political characteristics of our time. So to discuss this topic today, we have three very interesting panelists. I'm going to present them to you now. Christine Ockrent, you are a journalist today on France Culture, a radio station, and your broadcast is very famous. It's called Foreign Relations. And before that, of course, you are one of the most famous figures of French television. You are the first woman to present the Journal Télévisé on TV. Christophe Deloire, you are the head of an NGO called Reporters Without Borders. Your job is to make sure that journalists are protected around the world, and you are going to give us a lot of information of how you organize this protection and how you plan to fight against all the dangers facing both journalism and journalists. Those are not always the same. Hossein Derakhshan, you come from Iran. You paid a heavy price to freedom and journalism, and you spent time in jail in Iran. Today you live in Europe. You are a researcher at MIT Media Lab. You have been working before at Harvard University, and you published recently a very, very thorough story, very interesting story you're going to focus on today in The Guardian. So I'd like to address with you panelists, and of course at the end of our conversation there will be questions from the audience, and you can use the technology at your disposal to ask your questions. First, I'd like to ask Christine, there is a big crisis in the definition of what is a reliable information. Could you give us your insight of how you define this crisis and how you think it could be possible to solve this crisis today?
Thank you, Stéphane. It's very good to be here at OECD. It's such a huge topic, but I think we're all responsible in a way. Not only we journalists, but we consumers. Consumers of news, consumers of comments, and of course the technology has taken over. I mean, for my generation in journalism, we went through the blessed times where it was okay. You know, we had satellites. I mean, that was a great wonder. We had pictures coming from most parts of the world. But I could see year after year how we actually lost control. And now we have to marvel at the fact that Facebook is actually paying some money to Agence France Presse, which is a splendid agency and one of the few remaining ones in the world, to have a fact-checking unit. So it shows how the balance between these huge companies, and I think no need to lose time describing GAFA, and the way journalists can try and still deliver what matters most, which are facts. And of course, it's an era where the very notion of fact is being demented by opinion, or what that delightful lady, Kellyanne Conway, who used to be an advisor to President Trump, called alternative facts. Delightful expression. And so really the border between what is a fact, what is obviously a fake news, but also that sort of hazy gray zone in between, where you have, you know, opinion rather than trying to tell you what the facts are. That's really the major issue. And that's why I think that we as consumers, we have a lot of work to do. Because when we look at any website, short of The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde, and, you know, established brands, we really have to cross-check. And of course, it takes time. And usually we don't take the time. So I think we're also responsible for that discrepancy between what any democracy needs, and as you said, Stefan, now with the European elections coming out, we can see how much garbage is actually going on the social media, and how much manipulation there is. And the French media have suddenly become very excited about Steve Bannon being in town. Well, it would have been interesting to look at Bannon much earlier and to wonder, you know, what's happening in Europe at that stage.
Thank you, Christine. Hossein, I'm going to you now. You have been working a lot on a concept when you try to describe the major threat on information, on democracy, and maybe also on education. I mean, it's much wider than just information and journalism. You have been focusing on a theory of personalization. All the evil seems to be here in your mind and in your writings. Tell us about it. Why is it dangerous?
Thanks for having me first. I think we're entering post-Enlightenment era, to be honest. And the post-Enlightenment would be characterized by a few things, in my opinion. There might be more, but these are the minimum ones that I think are definitely part of it. One is the replacement of faith instead of facts. We are shifting from fact-based, maybe, societies to faith-based society. So you see a revival of religion or religiosity, but not the conventional religions. Actually, the politics is becoming a kind of religion itself. So partisan politics, it's becoming religion in many ways. The rituals are becoming similar. The space where they conduct and operate politics is becoming similar. The rituals and many aspects, the values, norms. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is the shift from text to images. That's also happening, which is very alarming, because fundamentally images cannot be used to make arguments because they can't talk about abstracts. Images are always specific. Photography, videos, they're always specific. You can't use them to make any rational argument. That's why this is quite dangerous in terms of I think some of the biggest achievements of the Enlightenment are being threatened by this shift as well. But another aspect which you mentioned is the personalization of truth, I would say, which has really alarming and damaging consequences, because when you dismantle, when you basically destroy the idea of society, then everything that is built on the basis of the society will also disappear. So if Thatcher in the 80s famously said, there is no such thing as society, I think the project of denying the society is now actively transformed into the project of destroying the society through AI, through machine learning, through algorithms. And the consequence is these personalized truths that we all individuals are living inside. And it has many aspects, you know, from the architecture, from urban planning, the collapse of the public space, the collapse of public conversation when it comes to journalism and democracy, the collapse of actually public broadcast. You know, the internet is becoming a new television in many ways, not just in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of form as well. It's becoming a personalized television for everybody. So even the most basic interactions that we had, because of the existence of public spaces such as, you know, public transport, public sphere, public places, these are also disappearing. We're all using headphones. So we don't even have that experience of listening to other people. Nobody's actually talking much in public transport anyway. So, and it has really awful consequences. One example is how justice would become sort of meaningless if you live in your personalized truth, because justice entails that you have to be informed and aware of other people's, for example, privileges and resources. And if you don't know how other people actually live with the interaction that would happen in public sphere, justice would become meaningless. So the best way that the neoliberal system is finally controlling society is by destroying anything that is public.
Later we'll see how to fight back, of course. Christophe, your NGO has a mission: defend journalists around the world who are threatened, defend journalism, of course. And in this mission, you face a contradiction, which is that what we tend to call quality journalism in Europe and in the US and in Asia tends to be decried and vilified as elite defending. And this is a confusion that has been very active, for instance, in France in the last 6 months during what we call the yellow vest crisis, in which journalists were on many occasions attacked, even physically. So tell us how you want to defend journalism and journalists in this very nasty atmosphere.
First, I would like to thank all the people in this room, because this is really an encouragement for us that you are here to deal with this very important topic. We have a lot of things to do, but first, let's deal with the challenges. I will deal with 3 types of challenges, and there are really new challenges in this field. The visible prisons, the invisible prisons, and then at a third level, the rules of the game. What I call visible prisons is the violations of the rights of journalists. When they are killed, like Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, but every month, journalists are killed in Mexico. And more journalists who, all over the world, who work on sensitive topics, very important topics, like environmental issues, discriminations, violations of human rights, corruption, are killed. Even in Europe. Even if Europe is the best continent for press freedom, in the past few years, journalists working about tax evasion and corruption were killed in Malta. Her name was Daphne Caruana Galizia. Or in Slovakia, his name was Jan Kuciak. And Jan Kuciak never met with dangerous sources. He never went to war zones. He just was a data journalist, studying reports, comparing reports of the European Union and in his own country. And he was killed for this. Right now, there are 350 journalists in jail in the world, in countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, etc. These are the classical violations of press freedom. But they are stronger because a lot of powers, whatever their status, they can be states or religious groups, or sometimes mafia groups, etc., they consider that really journalists are preventing them from doing what they want, so they should be killed. And something is new, is that as a power, you can directly send content to your public, and so you consider that those who embody sorts of filters, they should be swept away. Second level, the invisible prisons. When there is no victim, no blood, no bars, but when through money, new technologies, or laws that could seem to be soft, there is a huge control of news and information. When oligarchs, not Russian oligarchs, other types of industrialists go buying in the media just to exercise their influence or to help despotic regimes. And even in Turkey, which was a laboratory for the abolishment of pluralism, Erdogan also used this method beyond a lot of other methods. Visible prisons, invisible prisons. And then there is something bigger, the rules of the game. 70 years ago, the Human Rights Declaration was adopted in the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. The Article 19 is about freedom of opinion and expression. But in fact, in the history of democracies, the safeguards for news and information, for freedom of opinion, were established on a national level through constitutional guarantees, media laws, invisible for the public, and self-regulation. And in the globalized information and communication space where we live now, with no more distinction between public, private space, between different types of media outlets, even the distinction between human beings and artificial intelligence is, the machines is disappearing. Those guarantees are swept away. We cannot use them at all. So what we have to do is to rebuild a system of guarantees, not to go back to the former world, but adapt it to this global world. Because what happened beyond the phenomena, propaganda, information sponsored by interest, advertising, rumors, etc., which are now in direct competition for the first time. And this is unfair competition because there is a competitive advantage for extremists or false informations. Beyond those phenomena, there are causes. And the causes is that for the first time in history of democracies, guys who pass the laws, who create the norms, what we could call the architecture of choices, are not the parliament anymore with checks and balances. They are the guys who run the platforms. Code is law. They pass the laws. And they do not have any obligation. Could we consider that just when Mark Zuckerberg changes its algorithm, favors images as compared to text, or could have a bias, it is just his own freedom of expression? Should we consider that when we ask questions to Alexa and Siri, when they answer, it's just the freedom of expression of the guys who did it? Today, if we ask to Alexa and Siri, for whom should I vote, or is the president honest or not, they will say, I'm not able to answer this question, but they could do. There is no safeguard. So this is really something dangerous, and we have to find ways to impose safeguards. And Reporters Without Borders, RSF, launched 2 initiatives to do this. The International Initiative on Information Democracy, which was supported by 12 heads of government and state last November and will be part of the next G7 summit in Biarritz, France. And the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is a market solution to really promote the media outlets which are closer to the journalistic ideals than others. Because what we have to defend, and I think that at the end, the question is, what is really journalism? We could say this is a fourth estate, this is the expression, etc. Our societies, our companies in markets, we as human beings, and this is the most important thing, we need trusted third parties to take our decisions, and journalists should be trusted third parties.
Thank you, Christophe. Thank you for your answer. And I guess we all agree that democracy should not be enforced by platforms. This is clear. But at the same time, when we see who is enforcing democracy, parliaments, governments, and other institutions, most of them seems to be unaware or unable, at least technologically speaking, to even grasp the depths of the problem. So maybe Christine, if you had something to say, which actors would you trust to really enforce democracy, apart from states, of course, because states should not be involved in this kind of activity. So what is the solution?
Again, I think it's in democracies, and which is, by the way, a shrinking part of the world, and even in Europe, as we know, regarding human rights, and particularly the freedom of the press. And Hungary is a perfect example of a democratically elected president and government who have taken hold of the media. It's up to the citizens. And Christophe gave some very dramatic examples of journalists doing their job and paying the heaviest price for doing so. In France, as we all know, we have a tendency to always ask the state, l'État. Oh, c'est à l'État. Well, it's a very devious argument because the freedom of expression and the freedom of thought are pillars in any democracy. And personally, I don't believe it's up to the state to actually pass, yet another law and another law and another law, which is another French habit, without much effect, and it's dangerous. So again, I think it's up to citizens, and I think there's another way. Christophe mentioned the fact that we see these tycoons. There was an extraordinary piece in the New York Times about Rupert Murdoch and the way the Murdoch empire has been built and controls very important segments in our Western media. But there are also in the American system, and I wish we would have more of that in Europe, foundations. One of the Pulitzer Prizes was just given to one of those foundations to promote journalism. I mean, with a very good newsroom. As usual in the American system, you have a few rich families funding such foundations. And I think in France, we have rich families owning magazines or newspapers, and I think it's fair to say that neither Les Echos nor Le Point actually reflect necessarily, sometimes to their dismay, the interest of their owners. But I think the American system, and indeed The Guardian belongs to a foundation. These are ways to counterbalance the huge and very difficult to regulate power of these GAFA companies. And it's very interesting, but you know that better, having worked at MIT in particular, that whenever I discuss with an American colleague, what should be done and how is it that in America the federal government doesn't take any action to actually limit the power of these huge platforms, not only in the field of the media, by the way, but public health, artificial intelligence. They're taking us into new paths without any democratic control at all. And the reaction is always, oh, let's not have any government, any state influence. So again, it's a very moving scene. I don't believe at all that Mark Zuckerberg really, I mean, I don't want to be unfair, but I don't necessarily believe that he wakes up at night wondering, you know, what sort of ethical boundaries Facebook may have actually crossed over in the past 24 hours. So I think we have to try and build independent, well-funded media groups which are able to use the technology and at the same time help citizens, consumers. We're all consumers. And I think it's also too easy to say, oh, we as consumers, we have all the rights, but we have no responsibility. And I think we have a huge responsibility, but I stress the fact that the economy of the media is not something that should be sort of, you know, it's not wishful thinking. It's a real issue. I don't quite agree with you that the public media are condemned at all. I think it's not as true in Europe as it may have been in other parts of the world. And so again, I think we have to be concerned about the financing of independent quality media, which are not necessarily elitist media.
Thank you, Christine. Hossein, I'd like to follow up on your first words about the necessity to recreate a public conversation. I guess it could be embodied by some public platforms or public institutions, but of another kind, of course. Could you elaborate on that? And, of course, answer to the question asked by Christine, how to fund this reinvigorating?
Let me start a few steps back to explain what the crisis is. I think there are two specific crises now. When it comes to journalism, the main crisis is the crisis of distribution, because with the platforms, journalistic outlets have, for the first time maybe in history, they've completely lost control of the distributory mechanisms that they had in place. So, you know, even television, which was fairly in their control, the distribution aspect is out of their hands on, you know, with YouTube and with many other streaming services. Obviously text-based journalism, print journalism, which is declining anyway. So the distribution is the main problem. Then that connects us to the idea of the platform's dominance in the modern society. And what you were describing about the dominance of platforms is quite alarming, because this space, let's look at it this way. The space that states, democracies basically, used to control. You know, there were many aspects of our lives that was controlled by the state because we voted for them, because we asked them to represent us in that system, to control many of these aspects. So increasingly these aspects are controlled by the platforms. And these platforms are not only public, they're completely private, but they come from one country with certain norms and values that is not consistent with many other countries' norms and values. So there is an expansion of the influence of these platforms on all aspects of society, but it comes down again to distribution, because now they decide about the distribution of rides, you know, Uber, public transport, all that kind of stuff, for example. Not less obviously in Europe, but I think the trend is also that way in Europe. More privatization, less government interference, less funding for anything that's public, and et cetera, et cetera. So they govern the distribution of rides, gaze, which is the way they distribute, the algorithms distribute their, you know, YouTube videos, images, Instagram, all that. That's a governance of gaze and distribution of gaze. They also regulate and control the distribution of desire, you know, out and with all these dating apps and all that kind of stuff. So there are many aspects of life that were completely free of these platforms, and now they are dominated by the platforms. And you can think about health and education and all that. So, and specifically, this book is very alarming, very, very useful to read. By, I don't know how to pronounce her first name. I think Jose van Dijk. It's called Platform Society. I encourage everybody to read that because it connects all this problem to the erosion of the public values around the world, especially in Europe, which is a very alarming topic. So as for the solutions, obviously for different parts of the crisis there would be different solutions. But when it comes to funding specifically that you ask for journalism, that's a very interesting thing, because when you see, for example, when you rightly pointed to the success of the Guardian's funding model, which, yes, obviously comes from the foundation, but increasing is also coming from the memberships and the subscription model, which is reviving around the world. If you look at it more closely, membership is like a tax. It's a voluntary tax in a way. So if people are willing to pay, the vast number of people are willing to pay for that newspaper and this newspaper and that magazine, which maybe would cover, you know, a big portion of society, you could actually take that desire into a system which would be similar maybe to the BBC system or the UK funding system with the license fee, and come up with a kind of license fee that would fund many of these things. But because you have to solve the problem of the distribution of journalistic output, you have to, I think about a public platform for news, at least. Public platform for news, or public social media, or imagine a public Facebook, for example, that would be governed and run by a collection by a board that is comprised of the media, for example, the most popular media outlets, and it would be more transparent because then people can see what these algorithms do, how they change, when they change, based on which values and norms and all that. So I think that's a very viable thing to imagine, especially if it started with the current public broadcasters. So imagine the BBC, France TV, RAI, or some...
RAI, that would be difficult for the time being.
It would be slow, yes, I guess. Or, you know, TVA in Spain, or Northern European, German as well. So if they put their efforts together to create just a public platform just for the distribution of their own journalistic output, and that would be the basis, maybe one day it could be the basis of something alternative to Facebook for the whole Europe. Why not? Because now we have 3 internets gradually. There's the Chinese internet.
Hossein, just to get an idea, sorry to interrupt, but you take the example of The Guardian, which is a very elaborate system of funding by membership. How many news outlets in the world do the same with this kind of success? Is it a validated model, or it's just an exception that we can marvel on?
To be honest, I don't know, because there are different kinds of norms and values when it comes to publicly funded journalism. So that's why I was talking about 3 internets: the Chinese internet, American internet, and the European internet. This is already happening with the regulations that you see. The GDPR, for example, has kind of detaching the European, or the privacy laws, they're kind of detaching the European internet space or sphere from the American one. So increasingly, I think these 3 models are going to have their own kind of business models, or logic, let's call it logic, for public journalism, or journalism that is necessary for public values and public good. And they would have to think about their own way. So I don't necessarily think that the foundation model that works very well in the US would work in Europe. And I highly encourage people to think about the viability of this public social platform that I suggested.
Thank you. Christophe, you mentioned in the first words invisible presence for journalists. Do you include Facebook and Google in this definition, or
It's more about what I call the rules of the game. I will start by saying that it's not, I will not defend Mark Zuckerberg, but it's not easy to be Mark Zuckerberg. Because of us. Because we are full of contradictions. And I think all of us. We criticize Mark Zuckerberg if he decides to censor some content, considering that it can be dangerous. And we say, oh, this is censorship. This is private censorship. You should never do this. And the same day, we can criticize Mark Zuckerberg exactly the other way, saying, oh, you spread hate speech, and you are responsible for this. You should suppress it. And all of us, we do this, I guess. This is our responsibility to create the conditions of the responsibility of Mark Zuckerberg. And
you don't even have to be on Facebook, by the way.
But you know, in many countries, Facebook is now the public sphere. In the Philippines, for instance, Facebook is not just a social network, this is a public sphere. And this is, in European countries, part of the public sphere. And Google is another part. And possibly tomorrow, Weibo will be. And tomorrow, today, as citizens, we have nothing to say to Zuckerberg or to another guy who runs platforms with Xi Jinping. When Weibo is starting to internationalize, will we just say, oh, you have a huge bias in your algorithms, but this is the freedom of expression of Xi Jinping and of the Communist Party? Democracies have been established. For instance, laws have always been transparent. The new laws are not transparent. The public space in democracies is neutral, politically, religiously, and ideologically neutral. Not the actors in the space, of course, it would be stupid, but the space itself. This is not the case in Iran. There is a huge bias. It's not the case in China. There is a huge bias. We have to secure this. We have never secured it. And we will not secure it by saying that Facebook is a media. If we say, oh, very often we hear this, Mark Zuckerberg should have the responsibility of a media. It would be very dangerous. It would be like the editor-in-chief. He would have his own editorial line. This is really dangerous. I have nothing against Mark Zuckerberg. This is just the way things are working today. So that's why we have to impose this based on this really totally new change of paradigm, which is that we delegated the management of the public square to those people. Should they be public? Should they have a sort of public of interest status? In any case, we have to impose obligations. And so that's the work we are doing. And regarding the distribution, which is key because there is unfair competition. And this is totally new. In history, of course, safeguards were never perfect, but there was a clear distinction between journalism and advertising, for instance, even if sometimes there was corruption of journalists, of course, a lot of phenomena that were not complying with the ideals, but there were clear distinctions. Today, platforms are blind regarding the way contents have been produced. They can know if somebody paid to promote it, but they cannot know if a video is published, if it was in the frame of conflicts of interest or in a very independent way. So we have to create those mechanisms. And you spoke about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was implemented through institutions and norms. And we lost, you said we lost control, I would say we lost the rules, and we have to create the new rules. And that's why for the question of distribution, we have launched a process which aims at creating a mechanism where neither the governments nor the platforms, both of them are illegitimate, but a process that can help promote trustworthiness of news and information. It is based, we do work with a lot of media outlets from all over the world, BBC, Guardian, Gazeta Wyborcza, Tagesspiegel, Associated Press, AFP, DPA, EFE, etc., to create journalistic standards that could be implemented regarding editorial independence, user verification and correction methods, compliance with ethics, so that there could be auditing through market, through certification, and so that we can negotiate with platforms, with advertisers, with regulatory bodies, that they promote those who are able to prove that their processes comply with the principles of free, independent, and trustworthy news information. We started with a European initiative to avoid to have too many trolls. In fact, there are now 120 entities from Taiwan, South Korea to the United States, going through Europe, Balkans, everywhere. And it's a way to create an integrity factor for the platforms. Because I was a bit traumatized when there was a massacre in Ghouta district in Damascus. In Paris, on a search engine, I typed Ghouta, and I found first a French daily newspaper, second Sputnik, third Sputnik, fourth Sputnik, fifth Sputnik. They didn't pay the search engine for this. They are not allowed. I do not suspect this. But they could find ways with a lot of false links or artificial links to promote the content. It's so dangerous. Not because I have nothing to do, nothing against the Russian view, but we cannot say that Sputnik is very close to the ideals of journalism.
You imply that a public Google would have stopped Sputnik links?
I never spoke about a public Google. I said that we have to create the way to have an integrity factor in the algorithmic indexation. We have to find a way so that advertising expenses go to media that deserve it. Sorry, with accountability. But even regulatory bodies, today, or philanthropists, or they lack indicators in this sort of jungle. So we need to create sort of distinctions, but based on criteria, not on discretionary decisions by governments or platforms. So that's what we are doing. And the logic should be, in fact, that to deal with all those symptoms, very often our leaders or members of parliaments, they consider that this is just a question of freedom of expression. And freedom of expression, there are, according to the international standards, some exceptions. So this propaganda content is dangerous. How could be an exception, and how could I put it out? This is content regulation. But content regulation, in fact, creates polarization, because you are against somebody, something, some governments, etc., and there can be another reaction. We have to think another way, which is market regulation. And just, I will finish by saying that, in fact, in all democracies, and not only in France, there have always been a media regulation, media laws. And when you change the media laws, it changes everything. Fox News was created by some guys, but it was created by the abolishment of a very important doctrine by the FCC, the American regulatory and a bit legislative body, which was the fairness doctrine about internal pluralism. So when you change those rules, it creates new phenomena. We have to go back to principles, causes, phenomena will be solved.
In all of this, you have to preserve freedom of speech, and this is a huge problem, because some people say that disinformation, for instance, is freedom of speech. So
yes, but journalism is not just freedom of speech. Journalism needs freedom of speech, but and beyond journalism, trustworthy news and information, that's not just freedom of speech. That's to have guarantees on the facts, you need freedoms or rights and duties. And this is what makes journalism. And very often we just conceive freedom of expression, but freedom of opinion, as Hannah Arendt said, is a farce. unless the information and facts is guaranteed. So this is not just freedom of expression. This is also rules.
Thank you, Christophe. Christine, you wanted to react.
I fully subscribe to what Christophe recommends, but I think there's another issue which we haven't touched upon this morning, which is the issue of trust. And again, it has to do with citizenship. And sorry to insist, but it has to do with consumerism. Because you rightfully say that platforms now regulate or impose their own algorithm on many aspects of our lives. But again, nobody is compelled to be on Instagram and take a photograph of his pizza. And nobody has, you know, to go to use some of these platforms if indeed he or she believes that it infringes upon it.
Increasingly, they're becoming part of the social capital.
That's true, and the social and the conversation, the social conversation. But I think the issue of trust is basically what our democracies are confronted with. Not only trust in the media, not only trust in journalists, but trust in the very rules that Christophe rightly recommends. And it gets us back to this extreme atomization of the landscape that each and every one of us can actually broadcast his or her own so-called facts or so-called truth or so-called faith. I think your first argument is very true, that it's a question of belief and belief that, oh, I don't trust this guy, or I don't trust this person, or what I read does not correspond to what I believe. And so therefore it's not true, as it's not what I believe. And again, I think the issue of trust is what our democracies are confronted with. And again, I think these are very telling times, as you pointed out, a few days before the European elections.
Thank you, Christine. Hossein, I'd like to come back. Despite all efforts done by the NGO of Christophe and of many other organizations in order to reorganize the news, the information, and all that, we are facing a truce. For the next few years, for decades probably, we're going to live with fake news. We're going to live with disinformation and organized by huge powers, well-financed huge powers. So question is now how to educate people so that they can, in front of fake news, recognize them, identify them. It's a whole shake-up of the education system. And today, people are completely vulnerable, especially children. What do you suggest?
So, disinformation or fake news has always been around. It's as old as language, because they used to be called lies for a long time. But during the Cold War, they changed that name and it became disinformation because it was used by the army, by the intelligence services for rival countries. So the problem, though, now with social networks, and the reason I think everybody's panicking is not that it's a new phenomenon. It's because there is a new aspect to this phenomenon that is making it quite dangerous. And that aspect is linked to distribution, and that is amplification, which means the way suddenly something can become a trend or a huge topic that everybody is discussing it with retweets and likes and reshares and all that, which is called amplification, and especially when you can imagine non-human agents, bots or robots doing it, or when you, for example, see that there is suddenly something in Persian, for example, language that is becoming a trend, and when you see where this comes from, you see that it's from Saudi Arabia, for example. So the amplification is becoming, is defying borders in a way, or localness and countries, and that's another aspect, because suddenly, I mean, you could always say, okay, there are some people who are going to, on a demonstration in the streets of Paris, for example. The difference now with the hashtags, kind of Twitter, for example, demonstration, because I think hashtags are the equivalent of demonstrations in a way, when suddenly everybody starts to trend something. These are the new kind of digital demonstrations. But the difference is that, first of all, there could be Russians suddenly participating in this, whereas in Paris, maybe it's a bit difficult for them to travel to get a visa and come and be on the street. And then, so apart from those real people that don't exist in real demonstration, there are also bots that cannot join real demonstration. So for each person that you have, for each real person that you have on the street, you could have hundreds of bots participating in a digital kind of demonstration. That is completely changing the dynamics, because increasingly the social media have an impact through the conventional media, actually have an impact on policy and policymakers, and especially with the rise of populism. So it's a whole cycle. But coming back to the solution for, so one solution definitely to tackle disinformation is to control manufactured amplification, not the authentic amplification, which is something that the humans do in, decent, localized way. They do that. But there are some manufactured ones that the platforms can spot, recognize, and stop. They're trying their best, I think, but we don't know what they're doing because there's nothing transparent about what they do. So
if they try their best, it means they are failing.
They're still failing, but I think they're doing whatever they could, but I don't think it's an easy thing. Or I think there's an intrinsic conflict between the financial interests against these public values where they have to crack down on them. That's probably why they're not doing as much as we expect them to do. But
sorry to interrupt, but I think there's a very interesting and dramatic example with the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. And there was an investigation on, why was that white supremacist able to broadcast live for 17 minutes on Facebook without any control or interruption. And there was a very interesting story about the people who Facebook pays to actually watch, not control, but watch. And from what I heard, it's in the Philippines, a bunch of young kids, very poorly paid, not necessarily I wouldn't say well educated, but at least without very clear rules about what is right or wrong. And so, as you say, the issue is not so much how can these platforms actually control their own content, but how much empowerment they give to their own system to actually control that. And that was a blatant example, of course, of 17 minutes.
They spend much too little. They devote too little resources to this monitoring of contents. Yes.
So one other policies idea that I've been working on recently has been something I call platform neutrality. So platform neutrality is a separation of these three layers of content, of data, of user data, the algorithms, and then the platform itself, the hard part of the platforms. That could be the equivalent, this three-layered model, it could be the equivalent of what we used to have in computers, which was the hardware, and then we had the operating system, and then we had the software. So the same thing is now in front of us, but the problem is that there is no legislation, there's no regulation for the detachment of algorithms from the platforms. That's where the problem is, because the user data is detached already through many different mechanisms of privacy and all that. But if there is a mechanism, if there is a policy that could detach the algorithms from the platforms or devices, because we're not just talking about platforms now, because we're also talking about self-driving cars, for example, soon, and they're going to use their own kinds of algorithms that is completely opaque. We don't know how they make decisions, how they manage, for example, fuel, if they really care about energy and climate change, and all those kinds of things. So I think the right approach, I think maybe if it starts from one country, it would expand around the world. If there is any legislation that forces platforms and these huge companies to detach their algorithms, which means that they would have to create a free market for third-party algorithms. That would open up everything. That would create so much transparency and accountability and competition, which would lead to a situation where, for example, you might decide that you want to use your Google map with another algorithms to get around the city because you want to walk more, for example, or you want to use the local municipality algorithm, but with Google's map data that they have on the map. So there are also criticism about how they're intertwined, but I think it's possible to detach the algorithm the same way that we managed to detach the operating system from the hardware in the 80s. I think that was also the problem because you couldn't, for example, install a Mac OS on Windows and vice versa, but I think the regulations in the US changed that. So I think we need something similar now, and that would solve many, many problems when it comes to accountability.
Break the GAFA.
Not necessarily, no. It's a different kind of
it's called philanthropy.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, they should give away, but then, of course, they have to continue and continue to invest. So it's
maybe it could be a good opportunity if there are questions from the audience. Okay, there are many questions in the audience. We have 20 more minutes. Do we have microphones?
Hi, my name is Gilles. That was brilliant, by the way, so thank you very much. And you have ideas, that's even more amazing. I wanted to ask, I'm going to say something and it's leading to a question. But it seems to me that since like the end of the 20th century, we built up a new ethical standard, which was very much about honoring people's dignity and people's voice, okay? And that led to a lot of really great things, like women's liberation. And as a gay man, probably I would not be able to talk in this room today without it. But that became sort of a cult, right? It really went into like an extreme, and today I think we're in this existential pitfall where everybody's voice has exactly the same power, the same rights, the same authority. And that's true, that's exactly all the issue you've been discussing it. Where I want to have a question is that I don't think you're the only ones having that problem. For instance, I'm trained as a scientist. And scientists in the world today have a terrible difficulty to have their facts and the result of their work being heard and being having some authority. And it's really, really, really difficult. And it took forever for climate change data scientists to kind of have some sort of like consensus in the world. So I'm trying to see, aren't you fighting something that is actually much bigger? The real source of the problem, isn't it bigger than just the world of media? And could you ally with other important forces that are also relying on data? And I'm obviously thinking about the scientific world, to kind of like build a new ethical standard about truth that honors both people's dignity and at the same time the integrity and the accountability of the things that you are stating.
Include science?
First answer, in many countries, academics and journalists are targeted the same way. like in Turkey, but beyond Turkey in a lot of countries. And the same doubts are raised. And I think that in both cases, this is a question of institutions and norms. How do we recreate it? Second answer, climate change. In fact, the problems, the questions we are dealing with are very close in their logic to the question of global warming. There are symptoms, there are causes. We can consider that we could educate people, but will it really function? Will it be efficient in such an emergency for climate change, but also for the topics we are discussing? Do they really change their behaviors if the structures give incentives through amplification through algorithms, amplification through cognitive biases? The structures are so powerful. So it's not sure that education will be enough. And I deeply believe it won't be enough. In both cases, for climate change, we can adapt. We can buy more air conditioning devices. It could solve for one person the problem for a moment, but it won't solve the problem. That's the same thing, in fact, for what we are dealing with. We can find a new law. It will solve a problem, a very specific problem, but it won't solve the global problem. So, and in both cases, we are in a sort of tipping point. It wasn't perfect for climate change, but the IPCC was created to lead to common decisions, because you could try just to solve climate change in one country, it will not function. That's the same for the topics we are discussing. And that's why one of the outputs of the Initiative on Information and Democracy that I quoted will be the creation of the equivalent of an IPCC. And we are, in this moment, working on it so that independent experts, academics, can, so on a civil society basis, can consider work together on the key issues, very difficult issues, to make recommendations so that in an international way, governments can take it, platforms can take it for really game-changing solutions. Something is possibly a bit different for our topic is that regarding climate change, I would say that almost all the countries have the same interest, even if some countries could say, oh, if it's warmer, it's better for me. But normally, nobody says this. Our topic is more political. And there is a question of power relations between despotic regimes and democratic models. But I spoke about unfair competition between false extremist contents and verified information. There is also an unfair competition today between democratic models and despotic regimes. And despotic regimes have huge advantages. In this globalized space, they can control their population, export their content under control, not import on other contents. It's like a globalization without any rules, with huge distortions of competition. And so we have to find the intellectual tools, the references, the principle that will help all the people who want to defend democracy on all rights, not only political rights, to be stronger in front of those who have totally different ideals with, without such rights.
Thank you, Christophe. Other questions? Sir?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the panel, for a wonderful discussion. My question is, to take up the points that Christophe and others have raised, it seems very clear that we need new regulations, but we don't understand enough about the problem to be able to regulate, and the Senate inquiries in America with Mark Zuckerberg clearly showed that the legislature is way behind the people who are the developers. So they don't actually know what they want to regulate. They know that it needs regulation. The other aspect of it to me is the political economy, if you like, of the whole massive growth of economy, which is of new media, which has generated massive wealth and power for people like Mike Zuckerberg. And it seems to me that in a democracy, we have the right to require those people to put more into the solutions. They're simply pulling out cash, becoming ridiculously wealthy and powerful in the influences they're having, which are far-sighted, long-term influences, but we're not requiring any duties of them at all, really, except to get rich and occasionally to apologise for the things that they've done. So I think, you know, both of those things have to be taken in tandem.
Hussein, any?
Yeah, that's why I think that platform neutrality would be a very general solution for this increasingly alarming problem of platform dominance and platform evasion of any kind of regulation, because they operate in a very new kind of terrain, and the legislators are not even completely aware of this new terrain and this new game. But I also want to use this opportunity to talk about journalism and democracy, which was the main topic of this panel as well, because referring to James Carey, who was a media scholar in the US, and he has a brilliant essay on how we can perceive communication as a ritual more than just as information, which means that when we read a newspaper or when we watch a TV news bulletin, we are not just transmitting messages, we are also participating in a ritual together. That's a very interesting take on the communications, and it has important consequences for our time, especially if you put it next to the idea of the shift from facts to faith, because the ritual is very closely linked to the faith-based world. And then from there, I would love to go to his idea about the equivalence of democracy, public conversation, and journalism. He basically says these are three words for the same concept. It's very important. It's quite different from what people usually say, that democracy helps journalism or journalism maybe helps democracy. He says they are the same thing, and that thing is public conversation. So that's also linked to the erosion of the public conversation and the public sphere. The Habermasian public sphere, as a result of this personalization, is in decline. So that leads into the collapse of the public conversation, and that leads into the collapse of democracy. So it's not a coincidence these days that we see that journalism is in decline and also democracy is in decline. They're linked. They are the same thing. They are about public conversation that is not happening because of this personalization by the platforms and all that. But then there's also another crisis of journalism that I think would be, I know everybody's hungry, I'm also hungry, but this would be maybe my last kind of idea point. The crisis of journalism is a crisis about its main output that has been the news for almost two centuries. The news has been the main output for journalism. And now, the crisis that we see, it's so obvious that we don't even need to discuss it or explain it in terms of the business models, funding, the revenues, and the human resources, is about this, that news has lost its cultural relevance. It's not a business model problem, it's not an ethics problem, it's not a quality problem. Because the news has lost some of its main functions that it had for a long time. The first one was drama. News was the biggest source of drama in many people's lives from 2 centuries ago. You know, even before the invention of cinema, even before the invention of satellite television, international traveling has changed everything. Social media has changed everything. Instagram. So the TV, computer games, the amount of drama that you can get from many other sources now is much more than you get from news, and that's partly one of the reasons the news is in decline. The second one that is changing is that news for a long time would provide a kind of global connection. You know, 2 centuries ago, again, before satellite television and all these globalizing kind of mechanisms, news was the only way you could connect yourself, you could imagine yourself to be in a very distant country, in a different kind of experience. And brag about it in parties, for example, because the people who were literate at that time, the upper middle class and the upper class, would use this to differentiate themselves from the lower middle class and the working class. So these 2 aspects are lost now because of the other rivals. So it's led to the fact that news has lost its cultural relevance and therefore commodity value. People are not willing to pay just for news. They are willing to pay for something else that I'm
entertainment
saying.
And
yes. So I think because we need journalism, because it's basically public conversation, because we need the public conversation going, and we definitely need journalism as a result, we need to reinvent journalism without news at its heart. And I think the new heart of journalism should be drama, because that's the only thing that people pay for. By drama, I mean, imagine long form, narrative, text, audio, and video. Look at how non-fiction literature is doing well financially around the world. It has maybe declined a little bit, but not as much as the newspapers, obviously. Look at Netflix documentaries, the rising, actually, of the documentary as a cultural form. Look at narrative podcasts or documentary audio, which is rising around the world, and soon it's going to become very, very financially viable to make them for people who like to do that. So these are already happening, but I think journalism has to accept the reality that news is almost dead, and they have to reinvent journalism around something else, which I would say would be drama. But then art comes to the picture, because art is about emotions and drama in many ways. So the journalism of the future would be the combination of art forms and journalism. So imagine, for example, where music can meet journalism, where painting, for example, meet journalism, which is actually happening. BD, bande dessinée, is a perfect example of that. But, you know, you can even be more creative and think about opera, because it engages all other 3, 4 different art forms. If you imagine, for example, if you tell the story of the rise of Putin or the rise of the right or right-wing parties in an opera, for example, people are willing to pay for it, and it would be financially viable. It would still be journalism, because it's about current affairs and it's about facts. So we have to reinvent journalism.
So to make sure I understand well, the topic of today is, can journalism reinvigorate democracy? So is it your idea that drama-based journalism could reinvigorate democracy?
Yes, but not with the conventional definition of drama, which means imaginative or fantasy. Drama in a sense that it's narrative. The narratives are going to be the key to create this public conversation and help it going.
Thank you. Another question here. We've got a mic.
Thank you again for really interesting discussions, and I'm sure that what you've just said is deliberately provocative as well. At least I hope it is, because what you have just painted is an absolute nightmare for me. I seek to find the news platforms that are going to give me fairly neutral, reliable facts. So, you know, like Reuters, Guardian, Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, so forth. I'm looking for platforms that give me a creditable source. I know the journalists who are reporting on these things actually have probably been trained and are prone to doing their fact-checking. But I've also noticed very much that, you know, it's probably absolutely true that most journalists are overworked and underpaid. You see it in time and time again. You see situations on even BBC, for example, where you see interviews being done, and you see some, I'd say, opinion maker rather than an expert saying something which remains unchallenged by a reporter who is not actually expert in the field that's being interviewed. This lack of quality undermines the whole credibility of the whole journalistic profession. And I'm just wondering, if you were to go in your direction, the one that you just painted, it gets very close to Plato's noble lie. It's let's give a simplified, attractive version of what maybe the facts may be. And I think we're moving very quickly into alternative facts and to an unreliable journalistic métier, which will essentially then undermine democracy. So I would appeal for what you were talking about earlier, like, for example, establishing independent platforms. For example, one of the Spitzenkandidaten for the EU has talked about the creation of a European internet and European platforms where you can control, maybe not the news, but you can control who speaks on the platform in terms of these are serious people. That would be great for me. But I mean, I just had to challenge what you just said there, because you just painted a nightmare for me.
Maybe, I think, is your question combined? I think maybe let's take two questions, of course, and then answer them together.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. I would start by saying what you picture is just a dream to me, not a nightmare. And I will explain why. Actually, I think everyone is looking at social media as a problem, which I cannot grasp why. It's not a problem. It might be problematic sometimes. It is unknown. We tend as human beings to say something that we don't really grasp as an unknown, as a problem, but it's not. It's problematic. The idea, and I will start with telling a story. First, Facebook was used in between 2009 by me and my colleagues in Tunisia as a platform where we could express freely what we wanted and to actually combat dictatorship. Facebook was where we organized manifestation. Facebook where we had realized our revolution, when we got our democracy, and it was the only space open because we weren't only consumers. You keep saying consumer, no, we produce information. And we produce information maybe in a dramatic way, and I think by dramatic he wants to say we own our own narrative, and so we relate. We are not saying we're going to say false information. We're going to say we relate more. And that's what now the other side have understood of the game, and they're using it in another way. So the problem is not, I think the problem is you looking at a new thing with the same old strategy, with the same old reflections. We don't want to change them. And you want to get a new result, it won't work like that. I don't think that's the problem. The problem is in the logic. It's a new space, it's a public space, and we need just to learn how to play within it. I think the old actors need just to become better players. Algorithms changed last year, and I think it changed with the new rules with the European Union and with what happened with the tribunal. Facebook changed its private policy, and I've read it. It's like 20 pages, it's boring. But actually, legally, there is nothing more they can do. If we grasp it with all the conventions and everything, it's really perfect. Though then, as any sphere, it's like a public park in your neighborhood. What are you going to do? You're going to play there. At first, everyone is playing, it's okay. And then someone comes, a group of people who may not be following the good ethical rules, which stays also a subjective way of looking at things. What are you going to do? Are you going to shut down the whole park? Or are you just going to try to play better? And I think this is what he's trying to explain from the beginning, is that Facebook will be always there because it's a free space as a consumers, as a producers, as whatever we want to call it. And thank God it is. And maybe we need to think more about that dream.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a last statement or question, short, because 5 minutes left, and we need these two gentlemen to give you an answer if you wish.
Okay.
So I'm also a journalist, so it happens, from Poland. And when you're talking about reinvigorating democracy through the journalist, I just have to tackle a bit about fake news and why they exist, actually. In my opinion, part of the issue is because there is a demand for it. And the demand for it is because some people lack their representation in the media. So when you look at the media platform around the world now, you can easily say that most of them are liberal or so-called most to the globalist side. If you look at the UK, for example, yesterday was a journalist who was happy that things were thrown at right-wing politicians. When you look at the US, there was a journalist defending artists who cut the head of the President Trump puppet. So you have example like this. So no wonder that people by trying to looking for a platform which are closer to their mindset, find themselves in the fake news sites or Sputnik. The problem I have with that is also that media were increasingly, or in my country completely, became party political. If you say about Gazeta Wyborcza or other platform, I as a journalist on economic newspaper, we can easily distinguish which newspaper is supporting the opposition and which party is supporting the government, and it is very similar around the world. So if you have something like that, people don't trust really a journalist because they can find themselves another source of opinion, because everything is opinion now. So if you end up with the world like that, you can't do anything about it. So the question is actually, how can we revive the journalists which we all support from 10, 15 years ago or for 40 years ago?
Christophe?
Play better is for sure very important. It will not be enough. And if you play better with rules of the game that are against you, and you know that you will lose, no need to play better. I would say that I agree with both of you. There is for sure, I do believe, a crisis of news. I'm not sure that journalists should go out of the news, because if journalists go out of the news, other people will do. News will remain. So we need people, we call them journalists or something else, who we could trust due to the way they work. But for sure, there's something that we have to develop to really prove the usefulness of journalism. The crisis of news is that journalists are obsessed with events. And generally speaking, events by definition are negative. Accidents, sudden breaks, etc. We also have to learn as journalists to deal with situations, to deal with transformations, with evolutions. And Steven Pinker, who published recently a book about the Enlightenment and how to help it survive, said something very interesting. There are things that journalists cannot capture, do not succeed to capture, which has long-term evolutions and good evolutions, good news. And he quotes, for instance, a young German economist who say that every day in the past 25 years, there was a very important news that we never saw on the cover page. And it was true every day. Yesterday, 137,000 people went out of deep poverty. This is, for journalists today, very difficult. Of course, it would be stupid that every day it would be the same cover page. But this is something that we do not really read in one way or another. And we have to consider the way we work. And if people do not trust us, sometimes it's not very legitimate, but we should also consider, why are there so large parts of the population who consider that we are against them? Is this just because we are honest and they are dishonest? Probably the explanation is not enough. And Even when we have looks on very successful newspapers, we should also consider, do they really exercise pluralism? And do we really see how the world can be seen by people that we call as populist or whatever?
Last point, I think there is definitely a link between the collapse of trust that everybody's worried about and also the shrinkage of the middle class. That's it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid the time is up. Thank you very much.